On July 13th, 2024, the United States witnessed an assassination attempt against a former president, Donald Trump. The intention of this episode is not to capitalize on what happened on July 13th. It's to highlight some prior assassination attempts against U.S. presidents. That'll be the focus of this episode of Crime Chronicles. For the first 112 years of the presidency, from 1789 to 1981, presidents were not afforded full-time protection. Americans thought presidents in a democracy did not need protection. European royalty needed protection from assassins, but shielding the president from the public, even not allowing people to freely come and go into the White House, was un-American. And doing so would isolate the president from the electorate and be seen as a sign of weakness. Many of the threats made against U.S. presidents are never known to the public. The Secret Service chases down leads all the time of possible threats, but at some point, though, some assassins or would-be assassins have taken that fateful step of actually trying to kill the President of the United States. The first attempt to take the life of a U.S. president occurred in 1835. The target was President Andrew Jackson, and the location was a Capitol building in Washington, D.C. On January 30th, 1835, President Andrew Jackson went to the Capitol building to attend a funeral service for South Carolina Congressman Warren Davis. His attendance had been advertised in local Washington papers in advance. As Jackson walked past a throng in the Capitol Rotunda, a well-dressed, bearded young man named Richard Lawrence stepped forward. He brandished a pistol and fired. The cap exploded, but the gunpowder did not ignite, a misfire. Lawrence pulled another pistol from his pocket and fired again with the same result. Lawrence was tackled and subdued by several onlookers, including Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett. Jackson charged his attacker, intent on caning him, and yelled, "Let me alone, I know where this came from." Though he had no evidence, Jackson alleged that his political enemies had sent the assassin. It soon became evident that no one would partner with Richard Lawrence. Lawrence and some family members had immigrated to the U.S. from England around 1812 when Richard was about 12 years old. He lived a relatively normal childhood and became a house painter. His behavior changed in the early 1830s. Lawrence called the U.S. English colonies and said the U.S. had been unjustified in divorcing itself from British rule. He believed that he was a direct descendant of, or was actually, King Richard III, who had ruled England and Ireland in the 15th century. President Jackson was locked in a feud with economists at the time, trying to abolish the Second Bank of the United States. According to Lawrence, abolishing the bank would rob him of the money owed him as British royalty. Lawrence went to trial in April 1835, only 2 months after the attempt. The prosecutor in the case was Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner. Richard Lawrence was found insane and committed to an asylum, where he remained until his death in 1861. While the 1835 attempt on President Jackson was unsuccessful, the next attempt on a U.S. president's life occurred in 1865, and this time, the assassin was successful. The next attempt on a U.S. president's life occurred in 1865 as the Civil War was winding down. The target was Abraham Lincoln. The location was Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and the assassin was John Wilkes Booth. On April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary were watching a comedy called Our American Cousin. Seated beside them were Army Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. At around 10:10 p.m., an actor named John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the following morning. Popular, handsome, and successful, John Wilkes Booth was unlike most other American assassins. Booth considered himself a soldier for a cause that is held in contempt today, that being white supremacy, and he was an ardent supporter of the Confederacy during the Civil War. While the Civil War was not officially over, the South's defeat was imminent. Booth and several others had dabbled in espionage during the war, and the Lincoln murder was an attempt to decapitate the U.S. government. On the morning of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Booth went to Ford's Theater to get his mail. He was told that President and Mrs. Lincoln would be attending the theater that night, and he hatched his plot that afternoon. Booth linked up with David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt with a last-minute plan to kill the president and decapitate the U.S. government by killing its three top leaders. The conspirators' final meeting came around 8:45 p.m. The plot was set for execution around 10 p.m., with all participants striking at the same time. John Wilkes Booth would kill President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, exit the theater, mount his horse in the alley, and make his way out of Washington. George Atzerodt would go to the Kirkwood House on Pennsylvania Avenue and kill Vice President Andrew in his hotel room. Lewis Powell would go to the home of Secretary of State William Seward at Lafayette Square. Secretary Seward was bedridden, recovering from a carriage accident. Powell was to kill Secretary Seward, but Powell was not familiar with Washington and would need help escaping. David Harold would stand outside Seward's house and wait for Powell. Harold would lead them out of Washington. All four would escape to the South and be hailed as heroes. Booth's plot demonstrated that the more moving parts and the more people involved in a plan, the more that can go wrong. George Atzerodt rented a room at the Kirkwood House, but seeing the soldiers at the Kirkwood House, he got drunk, lost his nerve, and left. About the same time, Lewis Powell and David Harold arrived at the home of Secretary of State William Seward. Powell forced his way into the house and stabbed Secretary of State repeatedly, but the secretary survived. Lewis Powell ran out of the Seward house to meet David Harold, but Harold had gotten nervous and left, leaving Powell on his own with no idea how to escape Washington. At Ford's Theater, Booth knew the right moment to make his move. He entered the entrance to the exterior area of the presidential box, placed a chair against the door, and waited for the moment when only one actor, Harry Hawk, would be on stage. He waited for Hawk to say, "Don't know the good manners of society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-doggalizing old man-trap." Booth knew that this line would bring laughter from the audience, which would help muffle his shot. When Hawk delivered his punchline, Booth burst into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with his small Philadelphia Derringer. He leapt from the president's box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process. Booth escaped Washington, D.C. on horseback and led Army and law enforcement on a 12-day manhunt. He was captured at the farm of Richard Garrett in Port Royal, Virginia, and was shot and killed. Four conspirators, Atzerodt, Powell, Harold, and Mary Surratt, who owned the boarding house where the conspirators hatched their plot, were executed in less than 3 months. Other suspected collaborators were imprisoned, but all were eventually freed except for one who died in prison.
Even though President Lincoln had been assassinated, the federal government had not learned its lesson about presidential protection. The next attempt on a president's life came 16 years later in 1881. In 1881, another attempt was made to take the life of a U.S. president. The target was the 20th president of the United States, James Garfield, and the location again was Washington, D.C. The assailant was Charles Guiteau.
On July 2, 1881, James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, entered the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. There he was shot twice by 39-year-old Charles Guiteau. The president died on September 19th. James Garfield became the second president to be assassinated and the fourth to die in office. Garfield had been in office less than 4 months. Charles Guiteau was a delusional office seeker. Because he once stood on a street corner in New York City and gave a speech on Garfield's behalf, he thought Garfield owed him a diplomatic appointment. In those days, people could walk freely in and out of the White House. Guiteau became a frequent presence at the White House and the State Department until Secretary of State James G. Blaine finally told him not to bother him anymore. Charles Guiteau shot the president, but who killed him? The answer? Dr. D. Willard Bliss, who Mrs. Garfield entrusted with her husband's care. Bliss's incompetence and arrogance killed the president. From the moment he was shot, Garfield was probed with unsterilized hands and instruments, even on the railroad floor. American doctors believed that disease was transmitted by air, not by germs, and Garfield's body was constantly infected while he lay in the White House in the sweltering summer heat for 2 months. Finally, he was transported to New Jersey by a special designed railroad car where he died on September 6. Guiteau was put on trial. Despite displaying obvious signs of delusional mental illness, he was convicted and executed. A footnote, one of the men at the scene of the Garfield shooting was Robert Lincoln, Garfield's Secretary of War and President Abe Lincoln's son. He was present at his father's bedside 16 years before, and would also be present when the next president was assassinated in 1901.
Well, by 1881, 2 U.S. presidents had been murdered in office. Surely the federal government would learn its lesson and offer full-time protection for the president. Such was not the case. The next attempt came 20 years later in 1901. The 1880s and 1890s witnessed several attempts to harm U.S. presidents. President Grover Cleveland had an assassin show up at his house. President Benjamin Harrison had to fight off an attacker personally inside the executive mansion. But the next actual attempt came in 1901. The president was William McKinley, and the location was Buffalo, New York. The assassin was Leon Czolgosz.
On September 5th, 1901, William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, was visiting the Pan American Exposition, or the World's Fair, near Buffalo, New York. There he was shot by Leon Czolgosz, a self-proclaimed anarchist. McKinley died on September 14th. Leon Czolgosz began calling himself an anarchist, or a person who opposes any sort of centralized government, in 1900. In 1901, he attended anarchist meetings in Chicago, a hotbed of anarchism. President McKinley attended a reception at the Hall of Music that day, shaking hands in a reception line. A small detail of Secret Service agents, Pinkerton operatives, and Buffalo police officers were with him, but no one bothered to pull Leon Czolgosz from the receiving line, even though his right hand was completely covered by a bandage. For a man seasoned in war and politics, McKinley had a trusting nature. Attorney General Philander Knox later said, "I asked him for the country's sake and for his own sake to have a bodyguard when he went out. He laughed at me. He insisted that the American people were too intelligent and too loyal to their country to do any harm to the chief executive." As Czolgosz approached the president, President McKinley noticed Czolgosz's bandaged right hand and reached to shake his left hand. As he reached, Czolgosz fired. Czolgosz fired again, hitting McKinley in the abdomen. The first wound was deflected by McKinley's coat button, but the second wound would prove fatal. As word of the shooting spread around the exposition, a beaten and bloodied Leon Czolgosz was hurried away as a lynching appeared imminent. Dozens of suspected anarchists around the country were rounded up and arrested. Although some of them praised the murder, all were innocent and released from custody. Czolgosz was unrepentant. He was tried, convicted, and executed less than 2 months after the assassination. No one knew his true mental state. Although he may have had some abnormalities, he was fully aware of what he had done.
After the assassination of President McKinley, who was the third president to be assassinated while in office, the federal government finally took steps to protect presidents full time. The next presidential assassination attempt occurred in 1912, and it was the only time until 2024 that a former president was targeted by an assassin. The president, or ex-president, was Theodore Roosevelt, and the location was Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The assassin was John Schrank.
Vice President Theodore Roosevelt succeeded William McKinley as president in 1901. He served the rest of McKinley's term and was elected to a term in his own right in 1904. He left the presidency in 1909, but decided to run again in 1912, this time as a third-party candidate on the Bull Moose ticket. By this time, the president had full-time Secret Service protection, but not ex-presidents. On October 14, 1912, the former president was campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when John Schrank, a German immigrant and bar owner, shot Roosevelt in the chest. The impact of the bullet was thwarted by Roosevelt's eyeglass case and his thick printed speech. Incredibly, Roosevelt continued with his speech while bleeding from his wound and said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." John Schrank told police that he was visited by the ghost of William McKinley, who accused Roosevelt of killing him, and McKinley's ghost told Schrank that Roosevelt must be stopped from seeking another term. John Schrank was adjudged insane and spent the rest of his life institutionalized.
Former President Theodore Roosevelt survived the assassination attempt against himself. The next attempt came 20 years later, and the target was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. In those days, the presidential inaugurations took place in March and not in January. In between the time he was elected and the time he took office, President Franklin Roosevelt appeared in Miami, Florida, and that was where he was targeted by an assassin. But the assassin did not kill Franklin Roosevelt. Instead, the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, was accidentally shot by the man who wanted to kill the president. The assassin's name was Giuseppe Zangara.
On February 15, 1933, 2 weeks before he was set to be sworn in as president, Franklin Roosevelt appeared in the back of an open car at Bayfront Park in Miami, Florida. Accompanying Roosevelt was Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. A man named Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant, pointed a pistol toward Roosevelt and fired. His aim was thwarted by bystanders, and the president-elect was not hit, but Mayor Cermak and 4 others were shot. Mayor Cermak was taken to the hospital, all the while being cradled in the backseat of the car by President-elect Roosevelt. The other 4 victims survived, but Mayor Cermak died 19 days later. Zangara was a manual laborer and a professed anarchist, another proponent of no central government. Despite being obviously severely mentally ill, Zangara was executed on March 20th, 1933, only 1 month after he committed the crime.
After President Roosevelt survived his assassination attempt and Giuseppe Zangara was executed, the next presidential assassination attempt occurred in 1950. In November 1950, Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was targeted by assassins. The location was Washington, D.C., the Blair House. The assassins, or would-be assassins, were Rosario Torresolo and Oscar Collazo.
On November 1st, 1950, President Harry Truman was taking his customary afternoon nap at the Blair House, across the street from the White House. The Blair House was a temporary residence for the president, as the White House was being renovated. In front of the Blair House, 2 men converged on the police officer standing guard and pulled their pistols. One gunman, Oscar Collazo, who had no experience with firearms, forgot to release the safety. He banged the gun against his leg, causing it to discharge and strike a police officer. Collazo charged the steps to the Blair House but was shot by a Secret Service agent. The second gunman, Rosario Torresolo, was more proficient. He shot White House police officer Leslie Cofield. Cofield returned fire, killing Torresolo instantly. Officer Cofield died a few hours later. President Truman was not injured. Collazo and Torresolo were fervent Puerto Rican nationalists. They took their inspiration from Pedro Abizio Campos, the face of Puerto Rican nationalism. Their intention was to make a statement for Puerto Rican independence, and they decided the only way to do so was by killing the president. Collazo was sentenced to death, but President Truman, upon urging from Latin American leaders not to let Collazo be viewed as a martyr, commuted his sentence to life in prison. Collazo was released from prison in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter.
President Truman survived the assassination attempt against him, although police officer Leslie Cofield did not, and neither did one of the assassins. The next assassination attempt occurred in 1963, and unfortunately it was successful, and it's a crime that still haunts America to this day. In November 1963, John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, became the 4th president to die in office by an assassin's bullet. The location was Dallas, Texas.
On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was riding in an open limousine through downtown Dallas, Texas. The president was accompanied by his wife Jackie, Texas Governor John Connally, Connally's wife Nellie, and 2 Secret Service agents. As his limo turned onto Elm Street, 3 and only 3 shots rang out. The first shot struck a curb, causing a bystander to suffer a minor eye injury from the debris. The second shot struck the president in the back of the throat, exited his body, went through the seat in front of him, and struck Governor Connally. The third shot struck the president in the head, causing him to practically explode. Governor Connally survived, but the president was pronounced dead a short time later. 45 minutes after the shooting, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was shot and killed on a Dallas street. Police officers arrested Lee Harvey Oswald in a theater a few blocks away and charged him with killing Officer Tippit. Once he was in custody, police realized Oswald had shot all 3 men. Lee Oswald had worked at the Texas School Book Depository, the place where the shots were fired, about 6 weeks. He was a lonely young man, a former Marine who had lived in the Soviet Union and was a self-professed communist. 2 days later, in front of a worldwide television audience, Oswald was being led through the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters, being transferred to the county jail. While the cameras were rolling, Oswald was shot and killed by 52-year-old nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Ruby had been telling people that weekend that if he got the chance, he would kill that son of a bitch. He killed Oswald in a blind rage after seeing Oswald smirking for the cameras. For the rest of his life, even while he was dying from cancer, Ruby maintained he acted alone. A blue ribbon panel of statesmen were appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to investigate the assassination. The commission, chaired by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, concluded that Oswald and Ruby both acted alone.
While the JFK assassination remains the most talked about crime in U.S. history, it was not the end of presidential assassination attempts. The next one occurred in 1974. In February of 1974, Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, was the target of an assassin, but not an assassin's bullet. The would-be assassin was named Samuel Bike, and he tried to employ a weapon against a president that had never been used before.
In the early morning hours of February 22nd, 1974, 44-year-old Samuel Bike drove from his home in Philadelphia to the Baltimore-Washington airport. He entered the terminal, approached the first gate that was boarding passengers, and shot and killed police officer Neil Ramsberg. Bike walked down the jetway onto a Delta jet, told the pilot and co-pilot to take off. When they stalled, Bike shot and killed the co-pilot, Fred Jones, and wounded the pilot, Reese Lofton. A short time later, Bike was killed by a local police officer. No one knew at the time what Bike had planned. His plan was to force the airliner to take off and fly into the White House with the intention of killing President Richard Nixon. His plan was discovered when some cassette tapes he had recorded and mailed were received by several celebrities, politicians, and journalists. Bike was suffering from severe mental illness, and the economic malaise and energy crisis of the 1970s had hit him especially hard.
The attempt on President Nixon was not very well publicized for a lot of reasons, and many folks don't know about it. The next assassination attempts were very well known, and they targeted President Nixon's successor. In September of 1975, Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, was the target of two would-be assassins. Both attempts occurred in California on separate days, and both were women.
On September 5th, 1975, President Gerald Ford was visiting Sacramento, California, walking toward the state capitol building. As he was working the crowd, a woman with long red hair wearing a long red dress pointed a pistol at him. She was subdued and no shots were fired. The woman was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a follower of 1960s cult leader and mass murderer Charles Manson. She had moved from Los Angeles to Sacramento to be close to Manson, who was imprisoned at nearby San Quentin. She hoped her actions would provide another forum for Manson and to call attention to the plight of California redwoods. Just 17 days later, President Ford was again in California, this time in San Francisco. As he was leaving the St. Francis Hotel, a shot was fired from across the street. It was fired by Sarah Jane Moore, a middle-aged mother and three-time divorcee who had gotten involved in radical politics on the West Coast. A bystander named Oliver Sipple thwarted her aim. Both Fromm and Moore were imprisoned and eventually released.
In the case of President Ford's would-be assassins, the only injury was a minor injury to a cab driver who was struck by Sarah Jane Moore's bullet. The next presidential assassination attempt occurred in 1981, and the results were far more serious. In March 1981, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, was targeted by an assassin. The location was Washington, D.C., and the would-be assassin was named John Hinckley, Jr.
On March 30th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan was leaving the Washington Hilton Hotel toward his waiting limousine. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered nearby to get a view of the president. Seeing that all eyes were on President Reagan and none were on him, John Hinckley Jr. stepped out of the crowd and emptied his pistol. 4 men were hit: Washington police officer Thomas Delahanty, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, White House Press Secretary James Brady, and President Reagan. While Hinckley was being subdued and the other victims were being attended, Reagan was rushed to George Washington Hospital. All 4 men survived, but James Brady suffered severe and permanent brain damage. Hinckley was not motivated by Reagan's politics or any rational motive. He had become obsessed with the film Taxi Driver, especially the young actress who starred in the film, Jodie Foster, and he shot Reagan in an attempt to impress Foster, who at the time was a student at Yale University. Hinckley was found not guilty by reason of insanity a year later. He was institutionalized for the next 40 years before being released. From 1981 until 2024, no one has been injured by a would-be presidential assassin, although there have been many threats directed against U.S. presidents. I hope you enjoy this edition of Crime Chronicles, and please check out my book, A History of the United States Through High-Profile Assassinations, published by Cognella Press.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.